President Trump practically daring House Democrats to impeach him and declaring he welcomes a Senate trial, a process that could theoretically get underway by Christmas. Now, we've now heard and seen 12 witnesses testifying publicly at 7 hearings over 5 days. And while everyone is sorting through the testimony, we should note that the most damning evidence came straight from the horses' mouths. Fact: President Trump asked the Ukrainian president to investigate the Bidens. We know this not only because of the rough transcript of the July 25th call that the White House released, but because President Trump admitted it publicly.
Mr. President, what exactly did you hope Zelensky would do about the Bidens after your phone call? Exactly.
Well, I would think that if they were honest about it, they'd start a major investigation into the Bidens. It's a very simple answer.
Welcome back to Dr. John here. So this is what's happening here. Trump has been impeached twice, acquitted twice, and survived by the thinnest possible margins. Not because the case weakened, but because the math didn't quite reach 67 votes. The conduct never stopped. The accountability demand never faded. And now with new articles filed and Trump himself privately admitting losing the midterms means certain removal, the permanent impeachment shadow is finally preparing to become something real. The third time, maybe the one that catches him.
The attention of the House of Representatives. Mr. Speaker, I yield back.
What purpose does a gentleman from Texas seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, pursuant to Clause 2A1 of Rule 9, I rise to give notice of my intention to raise a question of the privileges of the House. The form of the resolution is as follows. H-Res 537, impeaching Donald J. Trump, President of the United States, for high crimes and misdemeanors.
Let's start with the numbers, because the numbers tell a story that words alone can't capture. In 2019, Trump was impeached for the first time. The charge, pressuring Ukraine to investigate Joe Biden while withholding military aid. The Senate trial that followed produced 1 Republican conviction vote. 1. Mitt Romney became the first senator in American history to vote to convict a president of his own party. 1 senator breaking the most fundamental norm of partisan loyalty in the most consequential political context imaginable, looked at the evidence and said, "This warrants removal." That was the first trial. The second was different. January 6th, 2021. The Capitol under attack. Trump impeached for inciting an insurrection. And this time, the Senate trial produced 7 Republican conviction votes. 7. The largest number of senators from the president's own party ever to vote for removal. And the Republican leader in the Senate, Mitch McConnell, stood on the floor and said that Trump was morally and practically responsible for the attack on the Capitol. He said it while voting against the trial's jurisdiction on technical grounds. He said it while letting Trump walk free. But he said it on the record for history. 7 Republican senators voting to remove the president of their own party, their leader calling him morally responsible for an attack on the Capitol. And still, the 67 vote threshold wasn't reached. Trump survived again. Now here's what makes those numbers so devastating for Trump. It's not just that he was impeached twice. It's not just that he's the only president in American history to face that distinction. It's that the case against him got stronger each time. The number of Republicans willing to convict grew each time. And still, he escaped. Not because the case was weak, but because the math didn't quite add up. The threshold, not the quality of the case, was the obstacle. Think about what that means. If the case had been weak, if it hadn't persuaded anyone outside the Democratic caucus, the acquittals would have validated Trump's claim that the impeachments were partisan witch hunts. But that's not what happened. The first trial produced 1 Republican crossover, unprecedented. The second trial produced 7, the largest in American history. The case was strong enough to overcome the most powerful partisan loyalty calculation in the most politically charged environment imaginable. It just wasn't strong enough to get to 67. The threshold was the only thing standing between the accountability the case warranted and the removal it demanded. That's the pattern. That's the permanent impeachment shadow, not physically removed from the Senate floor, but escaping the removal consequence at the last possible moment, again and again, surviving below the threshold while the case builds and the political conditions shift. Now let's talk about what happened after the second acquittal. Because the pattern didn't stop, the conduct didn't stop. And in May of 2025, Representative Al Green filed House Resolution 415, new impeachment articles, new charges. But this time, the charges were different. This time, they weren't about a single phone call or a single day. They were about a systematic pattern of authoritarian behavior. The articles specifically charged Trump with violating court orders, denigrating judges, and threatening democracy. These weren't vague accusations. They were specific charges built on specific documented conduct. The Federal Judges Association's rare public statement, the testimony from 26 judges about safety threats, the probable cause contempt findings, the rulings from 373 immigration judges, the 5 former defense secretaries' joint letter to Congress, the 38 commanders who refused to stand behind the president. Each of these was a documented instance of the conduct the articles described. Together, they formed a pattern, a systematic approach to using executive power to undermine the constitutional checks designed to prevent unchecked authority. Green didn't file these articles quietly. He stood on the House floor and said Congress had a duty to act before the abuses escalated further. He and his allies vowed to impeach, convict, and remove before Christmas of that year. They set a deadline. They said the urgency was real. And then something interesting happened. House Democratic leadership didn't take up the articles immediately. They didn't bring them to the floor for a vote. Instead, they did something that, on its surface, looked like restraint. They moved to table the resolutions. They sidelined them. But here's what's critical. They didn't stop publicly condemning the conduct. They kept calling it authoritarian. They kept calling it impeachable. They kept using the most dramatic available language to describe what Trump was doing. They just didn't move to the formal proceedings. Why? Because they were making a calculation. A full impeachment battle they believed could backfire politically in the current environment. The House majority was narrow. The political conditions weren't right, but the conduct was impeachable. So they did something that looks contradictory, but is actually perfectly strategic. They validated the accountability case while restraining the institutional action. They kept the pressure on. They kept the case alive. They just waited. This is the permanent impeachment shadow in its purest form. The case is there. The evidence is there. The constitutional justification is there. But the political conditions for the final step aren't there yet. So the shadow persists. The threat hangs in the air, and everyone knows that when the conditions change, the proceedings will begin. Now let's talk about the most revealing moment in this entire story. It happened in January of 2026 in a private meeting between Trump and House Republicans. The subject was the midterm elections, and Trump said something that he probably didn't intend to become public, but it did. He said, "If we don't win the midterms, I will be impeached." Think about that. The President of the United States, in a private meeting with his allies in Congress, acknowledging that the only thing standing between him and another impeachment is the outcome of an election. He's not saying the case is weak. He's not saying the charges are false. He's saying that if his party loses the House, the impeachment that has been hanging over his head for months, maybe years, will finally happen. That's the most credible private confirmation of everything we've been tracking. The accountability case is built, the evidence is documented, the articles are filed, the only missing piece is the political conditions. And Trump knows it. He knows that if the midterms shift the balance of power, the permanent shadow becomes something real. The impeachment that has been waiting in the wings will finally come to the floor. Let's bring this all the way home with 4 clear points, because I want you to leave this video understanding exactly why this pattern matters. Why the 7 Republican conviction votes are so significant, and what we need to watch for as the accountability trajectory builds toward its most decisive possible endpoint. The second impeachment trial, the one that produced 7 Republican conviction votes, the largest in American history, is the single most consequential data point in the entire permanent impeachment shadow story. It establishes that the accountability case was sufficiently persuasive to overcome the most powerful partisan loyalty calculation in 7 specific senators. It establishes that the threshold, not the quality of the case, was the specific obstacle between the documented accountability and the removal consequence that the the accountability warranted. If the case had been insufficient, producing few or no Republican conviction votes, the acquittal would have validated the case's weakness. But that's not what happened. The case was strong enough to produce 7 crossovers. The threshold gap is therefore specifically not a case quality gap. It's a partisan arithmetic gap. The difference between the votes the case warranted and the votes the partisan arithmetic provided. And a partisan arithmetic gap is the kind of obstacle most directly reducible by electoral outcomes. The midterms that Trump privately acknowledged would make his impeachment certain are the specific electoral change most capable of closing the threshold gap that has protected him through both prior trials. Al Green's House Resolution 415, the authoritarian behavior articles specifically charging court order violations, judge denigration, and democracy threats, is the most precisely targeted constitutional accusation for the most comprehensively documented second-term conduct. The Ukraine impeachment addressed a single transaction, a phone call and withheld aid. The January 6th impeachment addressed a single event, the Capitol attack. The Green articles address a systematic pattern, the ongoing conduct that describes how the entire second-term governance approach threatens the constitutional order. The systematic pattern framing is the most comprehensive cumulative case, addressing not just specific events but the overall governance approach, and its combination with the signal from key institutional figures that strong support is available if the facts warrant creates the most institutionally positioned impeachment trajectory that the permanent shadow has been pointing toward. House Democratic leadership's repeated decision to table Green's resolutions while publicly condemning the conduct is the most revealing institutional behavior in this entire story. It simultaneously validates the accountability case and restrains the institutional action. It's the most precise expression of the permanent impeachment shadow. Leadership isn't dismissing the resolutions as politically motivated or legally insufficient. They're specifically condemning the conduct, calling it authoritarian and impeachable, while tabling on political timing grounds. They're communicating that the case meets the standard and the timing does not. This maintains maximum political pressure on Republican members while preserving the strategic optionality to initiate formal proceedings at the most politically advantageous moment. Here's what we need to watch as this story continues to develop. First, the warranted threshold assessment. Whether the accumulating conduct, the Iran war's ongoing political costs, the judicial revolt, the Epstein accountability failures, crosses the specific standard that key institutional figures have identified as the condition for activating strong support for impeachment. Second, the midterm trajectory. Whether the accumulated accountability pressure produces the specific House majority change that Trump privately acknowledged would make impeachment certain. Third, the Senate 67-vote calculation. Whether any future impeachment trial produces the additional Republican conviction, votes that move the second trial's 7 toward the removal threshold. Fourth, the Green resolution advancement. Whether future House action advances the authoritarian behavior articles to a floor vote that tests the current coalition's strength. Here's the bottom line. Donald Trump has been impeached twice. He's survived both times because the 67-vote removal threshold wasn't reached. But the pattern of those trials tells a story that Trump doesn't want you to hear. The first trial produced 1 Republican conviction vote, unprecedented in American history. The second produced 7, the largest number of senators from a president's own party ever to vote for removal. The Republican leader in the Senate stood on the floor and called Trump morally responsible for the January 6th attack. The case wasn't weak. The case was strong enough to overcome the most powerful partisan loyalty calculation imaginable. What stopped removal wasn't the quality of the case, it was the math. Now, new articles are filed. New charges are documented. The authoritarian behavior pattern is laid out in the most comprehensive constitutional accusation yet. House Democratic leadership publicly condemns the conduct while strategically tabling the resolutions, keeping the case alive, keeping the pressure on, waiting for the conditions to change. And the president himself, in a private meeting with House Republicans, acknowledges that if his party loses the midterms, impeachment is certain. The framers set the 67-vote threshold to prevent partisan majorities from using impeachment as a routine political weapon. They required a supermajority large enough to reflect genuine bipartisan consensus that removal is warranted. That design is precisely what Trump's survival pattern exploits. The case is sufficiently serious. 7 Republican senators prove that. But the partisan arithmetic produces a gap between the case's persuasive power and the supermajority threshold. The permanent impeachment shadow is what that gap trap produces. An accountability mechanism repeatedly activated, repeatedly finding conduct sufficiently serious, repeatedly falling short of the endpoint the accumulated case warrants because the partisan arithmetic prevents the supermajority consensus the threshold requires. The removed from Senate floor framing is the most accurate description of this pattern. Not physically removed, but escaping the removal consequence at the most consequential last moment each time, surviving below the threshold while the accountability case grows and the political conditions build toward the specific electoral outcome that Trump himself has identified as the condition that converts the permanent impeachment shadow into the most consequential formal proceedings in American constitutional history. The midterm cycle is intensifying. The institutional assessments are developing. The shadow is permanent, but the endpoint is coming. And when it arrives, we'll be watching.